My name is Georgia. I'm an MCI grad from the class of 2018, and today my virtual chapel will be on vulnerability and courage. Vulnerability is often thought of as weakness. It's thought of as a bad thing, not something that people want to do or want to experience. They don't want to open themselves up or be emotionally exposed to other people in the rest of the world. And that's fair. Vulnerability is a scary thing. It's regular to fear that. But I want to talk about how vulnerability is a good thing, how you should be excited about it and kind of lean into it a little bit. So vulnerability is not actually weakness. It's opening yourself up. It's being honest with yourself and with others, and it's showing an unabridged version, an honest version of yourself, so you can forge a connection with others. Brené Brown is a shame researcher. She talks about vulnerability and courage a lot in her books, and she says that vulnerability is the center of meaningful human connection and experiences. So really, it's a necessary thing, and when you do use vulnerability and experience it, you open the door to a lot of different emotions, such as joy and empathy and love and excitement and creativity. All these things need vulnerability. And if you do choose to avoid it, you won't really feel any of those emotions at all. But vulnerability doesn't just happen. It does take courage. It's not one or the other, it's both. So courage is what kind of pushes past those fears and anxieties that pop up when an opportunity to be vulnerable arises. And the Bible talks a lot about courage too. A verse that definitely comes to mind when I think about courage is Joshua 1:9, and it reads, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." So this is just one example in the Bible that talks about courage. But there are so many others in verses, chapters, books that talk about courage, and that kind of reminds me of how God is walking alongside me in my vulnerability, and He brings up that courage in me. And so I'm not alone when I risk emotional exposure. God is right there alongside me. And when I think about that, I'm reminded of all the examples of vulnerability, especially at MCI. In the chapel in particular, there's so many examples of vulnerability that happen just in the chapel. When someone prepares and presents a chapel, that is a huge act of vulnerability. And they're risking emotional exposure by maybe talking about something personal. That's a hard thing to do. And that's not always recognized. And even for the person that presents that chapel, doesn't always think about that. It's not an intentional thing. They just use that courage and present their chapel. So it happens in chapels, it happens in choir and in musicals. Going up on stage and performing for other people is also a very vulnerable thing to do and takes a lot of courage, as I'm sure lots of you know. And another example I can think of is elections too in the chapel that happen. Students will put themselves up to be voted on by their peers, and that is a very, very hard thing to do. And I commend anyone who's done it. It does take a lot of courage and a lot of vulnerability. So it doesn't always seem like you're doing that type of thing when you're at MCI. I remember when I was a student, I didn't always recognize those situations where I was using courage and I was experiencing vulnerability. But when you look back, there are so many opportunities, even on a daily basis, in the MCI community where students and staff are just being vulnerable and being courageous. And that's really an awesome thing to think about. And that also continues after MCI as well. I know for me, a point where I was vulnerable was asking for help. I was not managing my emotions very well. I wasn't managing my anxiety, and a way for me to be courageous and to be vulnerable was reaching out, looking for a mental health professional, and getting back up on my feet again and being able to manage my emotions. So that was an act of courage for me, an act of vulnerability. And even another one that comes to mind is this virtual chapel. I remember when Paul Peters asked me to do this chapel, I wanted to say no so many times. The fears and anxieties were telling me, this is a terrible idea. You shouldn't do this. But I used courage to push past because I knew, and God told me, that this was a good experience and a good opportunity to talk about vulnerability. So my challenge to you, knowing that vulnerability does look different for everybody, my challenge to you is to mind the gap. And what that means is a concept from Brené Brown's book. To mind the gap is to think about where vulnerability is now in your life and where you see it now and where you experience it now, to where you want it to be, where you want to use and see vulnerability in your life. And to recognize the distance between those two places and use strategies to see the other side of that and to experience vulnerability and courage. One way that I do that is I ask myself the question, what is worth doing even if I fail? I ask myself, what is worth doing even if I fail? Why should I risk this emotional exposure? Is it worth it? And most of the time the answer is yes. But asking myself that question helps me get from where I am being vulnerable to where I want to be. And so if you want to learn more about vulnerability, Brené Brown has a ton of books out there that talk about it, and she's a great resource to go to, but there are also lots of other researchers that talk about vulnerability and can help you learn more. But the biggest thing I recommend is just practicing it. It looks different for everybody. For some people, vulnerability is asking for help or sharing your faith, asking for a promotion or helping out a friend. It looks different for everybody. And so I encourage you to practice it in your daily life and see how all these new emotions and these good, exciting emotions like joy and love and empathy and creativity will come into your life. Thank you.